I love you too.
Whoa, what the fuck? You're scaring me!
Why don't you take the bed for yourself tonight? And I'll just go sleep at Ian's and I'll come back right in the morning.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Today, I am recommending Obsession, the latest hit horror thriller of 2026. As soon as the movie was released, glowing word of mouth turned it into an unexpected success and one of the year's biggest breakout sensations. It abandons the traditional horror formula of relying on bloody imagery, and not a single ghost or monster appears throughout the entire film. Instead, its subtle and oppressive exploration of human nature makes it one of the most unsettling thrill rides in recent years. Now let us find out how this little-known movie manages to leave such a powerful impression long after it ends. The story begins with four inseparable friends. All four work at the same record store and have known one another for years, but they are caught in a complicated web of unrequited feelings. Bear, the shy and timid protagonist, has secretly loved his coworker Nikki for 7 years but has never dared to confess his feelings. The independent and intelligent Nikki has never felt the same way about Bear, and she previously spent 2 years in an ambiguous relationship with their friend Ian. Meanwhile, the gentle and sensitive Sarah quietly has feelings for the constantly self-effacing Bear. The friendship and tangled crushes among these four people lay the foundation for the tragedy that follows. As the story officially begins, Bear knows he is running out of time to confess, so he finds a waitress at a restaurant and asks her to help him rehearse what he plans to say. His reserved and poetic delivery sounds incredibly sincere to everyone else, but Ian knows Nikki well and bluntly tells him that it will never work. To help Bear grow closer to Nikki, Ian offers what sounds like a joking suggestion, telling him to tease her with a nickname from her childhood to lighten the mood.
You know she's sensitive about
Like,
that.
hey, remember when you used to get bullied? Everybody called you Freaky Nikki? She'll be like, oh my God, no, Bear, that was so long ago, no, please.
This seemingly harmless joke is actually a crucial piece of foreshadowing planted by the director. While Bear is carefully preparing his confession, an accident suddenly shatters his peaceful life. His cat, his only companion, accidentally consumes some spilled painkillers and dies. That night, the quiet and emotionally restrained Bear suppresses his feelings as usual, calmly takes care of his cat's body, and cleans every trace from the room before finally sitting beside the bed and breaking down in tears alone. Bear has always handled problems this way, instinctively retreating whenever something happens, which is why he has rehearsed his confession countless times over 7 years only to lose his nerve every single time. The grief of losing his cat leaves him with no desire to socialize, but a phone call from Nikki inviting him to a gathering makes him reconsider. Nikki tells him that she is preparing to submit her resignation and that the two of them will have very few chances to see each other afterward.
What?
Yeah, so I'm putting in my 2 weeks.
Really?
Not wanting to be left with permanent regret, Bear ultimately agrees to go. During their conversation, Nikki accidentally drops her treasured necklace down a drain. After learning what happened, Bear decides to buy her a Nin necklace before meeting her, while choosing a gift at the shop. The perfectionistic Bear is unimpressed by the ordinary jewelry and instead finds himself drawn to a one-wish willow. The product claims that anyone who snaps the willow in half can make one wish.
I like this.
Yeah, well, they've been pretty popular since we put them out. You know, everybody wants a wish. Okay, well, don't come back complaining.
Do people complain about these or?
Well, they're kind of like collectibles, so some people don't open them, but the people who do, you know, come back and complain.
Complain because they're mad because it doesn't work?
Yeah, or whatever.
Or it does work and it like ruins their lives?
Or they die or wish they were dead.
Despite the ominous nature of that warning, Bear does not take it seriously. Throughout the gathering that evening, Bear still cannot summon the courage to reveal the feelings he has kept hidden for 7 years. After the gathering ends, he offers to drive Nikki home, and they spend the journey talking about their dreams and their lives. But fear still keeps him from speaking. Only when Nikki is about to enter her home does Bear finally follow Ian's advice and call out her childhood nickname.
Night, Freaky Nikki.
Ew, don't call me that.
I know, I was kidding.
When Nikki hears Bear casually use the nickname from her youth, she immediately tells him that she does not like being called that and directly asks whether he has feelings for her.
Do you like me?
What?
Because if you do, now's the time to tell me.
I think we're good friends.
Okay.
Filled with regret, Bear sits inside his car and looks at the one wish willow he never managed to give her before impulsively making an extreme and obsessive wish.
I wish Nikki Freeman loved me more than anyone in the world.
After the wish is made, something truly strange happens. Nikki, who had been preparing to go inside, suddenly turns around and even invites Bear into her home to talk, claiming that she recently lost a pet and cannot soothe her sadness while spending the night alone. Bear is thoroughly confused because it was his cat that died.
Oh, wait. I mean, you lost your cat.
After a brief pause, Nikki hurriedly changes her story and says that she is simply heartbroken over what happened to him. Bear instinctively looks at the broken willow in his hand as an unbelievable possibility enters his mind. Could the wish he just made have actually come true? But Nikki's words and behavior are completely different from her usual self, and her body even seems to move toward the passenger seat beyond her control as she invents a story about her father being terminally ill. The soft-hearted Bear ultimately takes Nikki back to his home. The moment Nikki steps inside Bear's house, her emotions transform completely, as though she is intoxicated by his scent, displaying an overwhelming dependence and adoration before asking Bear to stay with her that night.
Can you sleep with me? Please, I'll get in my head all night and stare at the ceiling.
Watching the woman he has worshipped from afar for 7 years make such a request, Bear knows that something is wrong, but he is so desperate to hold on to this long-awaited affection that he ultimately allows everything to continue. Just as their relationship is about to cross a physical boundary, the real Nikki's consciousness briefly awakens.
What the fuck? What?
Oh my god, I'm so sorry.
You kissed me!
I know, I thought I saw something. I don't know, I'm sorry.
No, Nikki.
I don't know, can we sleep? I'm sorry.
You don't have to be sorry, just... Shit, you made me feel like I did something you didn't like.
No, I'm sorry.
The sudden shock forces Bear to realize that the changes created by his wish are far less wonderful than he imagined. To prevent anything else from happening, Bear can only curl up on the floor for the rest of the night, while the bizarre images he just witnessed continue replaying in his mind. He goes into the living room and opens his computer, hoping to find legends or warnings connected to the One Wish Willow. But even after searching through countless web pages, he cannot find anything useful. Unfortunately, even more disturbing events soon follow. Early the next morning, Nikki digs up the cat's body and places it on the kitchen floor, claiming that she wants Bear to have something to remember it by. The two then head to work at the record store together, and when Ian sees them arriving side by side, he assumes Bear's confession was successful and immediately pulls him into a corner to ask what happened. Bear uses the opportunity to tell Ian about all the strange events from the previous night. Ian immediately spots a major inconsistency, because Nikki has a terrible relationship with her father and has not spoken to him in years, making it impossible that news of his illness could have caused her breakdown. Ian concludes that Nikki has probably suffered a psychological collapse or lost control after taking drugs. While the two men whisper in the corner, Nikki stands nearby with a smile on her face and her eyes locked firmly on Bear. That evening, Bear deliberately avoids driving Nikki home after work.
Thank you. Stay.
Nikki,
Bye.
I don't know if I can take you home today.
I know, I'm just grabbing my purse. Oh, excuse me.
Are you gonna take her? Yeah, wanna take her?
Late that night, Ian calls and says that Nikki was probably only affected by drugs and mistakenly believed that the two men had been talking about her behind her back. The scene then reveals a disturbing twist, because Nikki never went home and has instead arrived alone at Bear's door to apologize. She gently explains her recent abnormal behavior and directly points out the fact that Bear has feelings for her.
I really like what we have, and I want to be honest about some things, and it's really important for me.
It's okay. I get it.
I know you like me, Bear.
With Nikki actively guiding him, Bear finally confesses the feelings he has suppressed for 7 years, and the two officially begin a relationship. Everyone else is bewildered by this sudden romance, but Bear is too immersed in happiness to notice anything wrong. Then a phone call from Ian shatters Bear's brief happiness. Ian's investigation reveals that Nikki's father is perfectly healthy and has never been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Nikki had also clearly told Sarah during an earlier conversation that she only saw Bear as a close friend. Ian suspects that Nikki is deliberately lying to gain sympathy because she either has an ulterior motive or is experiencing a severe psychological crisis. At that moment, Bear finally understands that the tenderness and affection before him were never genuine, but the result of the One-Wish Willow's curse forcibly rewriting reality. After hesitating for a long time, Bear considers confronting Nikki about her father's supposed illness, but his fear of losing her if he exposes the truth ultimately makes him suppress the question. Nikki then gives Bear a tiger's eye necklace that has been passed down through her family. She tells him that the necklace originally belonged to her grandmother, who passed it down to Nikki's mother before it eventually came to her.
Why are you giving it to me?
Bear, I love you so much. I don't think I could live without you.
The sudden weight of such profound affection shakes Bear deeply, and he finally asks Nikki for the truth about her father's illness. The moment the words leave his mouth, Nikki's expression suddenly changes.
No, don't do that! I thought we were having a nice day.
We are. Sit
Why
down.
does it matter? I thought we were having a nice
We are.
After Nikki calms down, Bear is too frightened to keep questioning her, but the true horror is only beginning. At 3:45 in the morning, Bear wakes to find that Nikki is no longer in bed and is instead curled up alone in a dark corner.
What are you doing?
Watching you sleep.
Wearing my sweater, huh?
Smells like you.
Can you come back to bed?
No.
She then breaks down and accuses Bear of not loving her enough. This terrified Bear, leaving him no choice but to lie down and pretend to be asleep. Then something even more terrifying happens.
Why don't you love me?
Nikki! What do you want me to do?
For Sandy, okay?
The next morning, Bear discovers that Nikki secretly cut off some of his hair, but he is too frightened to confront her and can only quietly beg her to stop behaving so strangely. Nikki sweetly promises that she will never do anything like that again and even prepares breakfast for him. But when Bear gets ready to leave for work, he discovers that the front door has been completely sealed with duct tape. The obsessive Nikki wants to imprison him inside the house and force him to stay with her. Bear refuses to argue and simply tears through the tape before hurrying out to work. The camera remains fixed on Nikki as she stands perfectly still with a twisted, rigid smile, refusing to move even after losing control of her bodily functions. During his lunch break, Bear opens the lunchbox Nikki prepared and finds two photographs inside. One is labeled, "This is you," while the other is labeled, "This is not me." This is the final cry for help left by the real Nikki while she was briefly conscious. Sarah happens to notice the notes inside the lunchbox and jokes about how intimate Bear and Nikki have become before casually asking about his cat. The mention of the cat suddenly makes Bear think about the meat hidden inside the lunchbox, and a wave of violent nausea rises in his throat as he bends over a trash can and vomits. That night, Bear remembers the One-Wish Willow and considers making another wish to reverse the situation, but the product states that each user is allowed only one wish. He finds the customer service number on the packaging and calls it, hesitating for a long time before cautiously asking whether an active wish can be changed or revoked. The representative's answer destroys his final hope, because once a wish takes effect, it can neither be altered nor revoked, and the only way to break the curse is for the person who made the wish to die. Bear then asks the representative how he can resolve his current situation. The representative falls silent, but an endless series of agonized screams begins coming through the receiver.
You want to talk to her?
What? Who?
You want to talk to her?
Who is that?
Nikki. Do you want to speak to her?
Those screams belong to the real Nikki, who is trapped inside her own body. When Bear returns home, he finds Nikki still standing in the exact same position as that morning, with unidentified stains covering her mouth and clothes. Her behavior now resembles that of a cat's spirit possessing a body and waiting obsessively at home for its owner to return. At a gathering with their friends, the tragedy finally reaches its breaking point. During a game, A black guest draws a card instructing him to switch seats with Bear. The guest sits beside Nikki while Bear moves to the opposite side and draws a dare. His task is to kiss Sarah, who is sitting to his left. Before anyone can react, Nikki walks behind Sarah and violently drags her chair backward. After Bear hurriedly completes the kiss, Nikki immediately announces the full and obsessive extent of her love for him.
And everyone in this room will die, never feeling the strength of connection I have felt with my Bear.
Her declaration instantly freezes the entire room. Ian approaches Nikki and asks whether she is all right, but she lies and claims that she was only joking. Unable to press her any further, Ian turns away to get drinks for the other guests. But then, without warning, something changes.
Any other takers?
No one else understands what is happening, but Bear knows that the real Nikki has returned and that two souls are now fighting for control of the same body. After the gathering ends, Bear takes the confused and unstable Nikki back home. He is no longer willing to cling to their false happiness and desperately wants to confirm whether the person before him is the real Nikki. But the cursed Nikki deliberately refers to herself by the childhood nickname she hates most. Completely confirming Bear's suspicions, Bear suggests that they spend a little time apart to calm down. But Nikki collapses in tears and says that she can no longer return to the person she once was and can only love him with this obsessive madness.
You're scaring me! Why don't you take the bed for yourself tonight? And I'll just go sleep again. I'll come back right in the morning.
Okay.
Terrified, Bear lies rigidly in bed all night without daring to sleep. Late that night, Sarah sends Bear a message asking to meet because she has something important to tell him. Bear is initially too frightened to leave, but Sarah's persistence eventually forces him to sneak out. Before he goes, the real Nikki briefly regains control of her body and desperately begs Bear to end her suffering. That moment completely exposes Bear's selfish nature.
What's so bad about being with me?
I've never been with you, Bear.
When Bear learns that the real Nikki does not love him and even despises the bond forced upon her, he feels no guilt, only resentment. He deliberately ignores her plea for help, preferring to lose himself in the false affection created by the curse rather than return to reality and accept her rejection. When Bear and Sarah meet inside her car, Sarah shares the good news that she has been accepted into college before revealing the final truth. Nikki and Ian were involved for 2 years, and Sarah knows Nikki well enough to understand that a relationship between Bear and Nikki could never happen naturally. But while the two were talking, the completely unhinged Nikki smashes the car window with a brick, then reaches inside and grips Sarah's head with all her strength. The timid and cowardly Bear remains frozen throughout the entire attack and makes no attempt to save Sarah. After the attack, Nikki gently comforts Bear and tells him that his wish was the true cause of the tragedy because this overwhelming love was exactly what he had wanted. She then demands that Bear help her dispose of Sarah's body. After removing every trace of what happened, Bear picks up Sarah's blood-stained college acceptance letter. The bright future that should have belonged to Sarah has now been completely destroyed by one moment of Bear's selfish obsession. Only then does Bear finally come to his senses. He rushes to the gift shop that sold the One Wish Willow and furiously demands to know why the employee would sell something like it. The employee tells Bear that making the wish was his own choice and that he cannot blame other people afterward. The employee also explains that the wish can be reversed if Bear finds someone else to make a wish that directly contradicts the original one. After hearing this, Bear buys the final 2 One Wish Willows in the store. At first, Bear tries to snap one himself and make the opposite wish, but the rules allow each person only one wish, and no matter how hard he tries, the willow refuses to break. He immediately finds Ian, tells him about every tragedy caused by the One Wish Willow, and asks his best friend to make a wish that will cancel the curse. Ian does not believe the supernatural story and casually grabs one of the willows before wishing for $1 billion.
Wish for $1 billion.
Bear has no choice but to take the other willow home and ask Nikki to make the opposite wish. By now, Nikki has completely lost her mind and keeps demanding to know why Bear does not love her while frantically hurting herself. Ian arrives to help and forces his way through the door, only for the unstable Nikki to shoot and kill him. After causing the deaths of 2 close friends in succession, Bear falls into complete despair. He hides in the bathroom intending to take his own life. But the cowardly Bear cannot face death directly and ultimately chooses to overdose on pills the moment he swallows them. However, he regrets his decision and tries to make himself vomit. Just then, the eerie melody of the wish begins playing again, and Bear stops trying to save himself as though something has taken control of him. He walks out of the bathroom and shares a loving gaze with Nikki. At this point, all the earlier clues fall into place, because Nikki used the final intact one-wish willow to make the opposite wish for Bear, but she made the wish a moment too late, because Bear had already swallowed a massive amount of medication. Seeing Bear close to death, the grief-stricken Nikki raises the gun and prepares to follow him. At the final moment before she pulls the trigger, Bear's life slowly fades away. The curse created by the wish automatically ends, and the real Nikki finally returns. The movie ends,